So let's have a quick chat about parasocial relationships and grief related to them. So, a parasocial relationship is where we engage with a person either through social media, their music, movies, other media sources, fandom type stuff, and we incorporate them into our lives, even though we don't actually know that. So, when somebody passes away that we have a parasocial connection to, it can create an interesting grief process. But that grief process comes from a relationship that was completely one sided. We didn't know this person, we didn't call them, we maybe interacted with them briefly in some kind of social setting, whether they commented back to us on social media or we met them at a fan festival or whatever. But we didn't have a relationship with them. So the grief looks different. So we walk through the tasks of mourning, but in a different way, right? So we have to accept that the loss is real, which is hard to do when you don't know the person personally. When you know the person personally, you can pick up the phone and try to call them and they don't answer, or you've actually seen, their body at a funeral or what have you, right? You can do things to grasp the reality. But when the only way you've had a relationship with the person is through a lens of some sort, it's hard to embrace the fact and accept the fact that that person is no longer alive. Hence, in the 80s and 90s, all the Elvis sightings. Once we accept the loss, we have to feel the feelings. And those feelings are uncomfortable. And some of the feelings that we have for parasocial grief are super uncomfortable because there's also this kind of self-gaslighting that we do when we say, well, maybe I shouldn't feel that way because I didn't really know this person. But the impact that they may have had on your life. And that's what you're grieving for, right? And then this opens us up to the idea that if somebody has played the villain in your story or in anybody's story as part of their parasocial identity, that complicates things. Because we love a good redemption story. We love a good transformation. I mean, just look at this app. People do transformation videos all the time, right? But we love a good redemption story. We love when the bad guy sees the error of his ways and makes a change and becomes a good guy. My biggest reference for that is Flynn Rider in Tangled. Or the anti-hero, right? They might not become a full hero, but they become kind of an anti-hero. But we like when somebody sees the error of their ways and changes and becomes the best version of themselves. The problem with the parasocial relationship, though, is that you don't know that person. You know what they want you to know about them. What you think you know about them might not be who they are. That might just be their public persona. And their private persona may look very, very different. So there's this tearing that happens in the psyche, and it's a struggle to figure out what's right, what's not right, what feels right, what doesn't feel right. So when we lose out on the redemption story, we have to grieve for the loss of that future. Figuring out how to move forward into a future without that possibility is part of the tasks of mourning. It's kind of like hope died in that moment, right? Grief is complicated and it's sticky, and it's not just the Kubler-Ross 5 emotions associated with grief, because those don't even come in the same order for everybody, and they're cyclical and they come back around like waves in the ocean. You can't oversimplify grief and put a pretty bow on it and think that everybody's going to grieve the same way, and you can't impose your grief process on somebody else, especially if they're walking through their own. Grief is intensely uncomfortable. It's complicated. It has a lot of emotions that are uncomfortable by themselves, but then they're layered on each other, which makes them even more uncomfy. There are people who are trained in grief counseling and grief processes that can help you walk through things if they stay in a lingering place, or if they're impacting you to a pretty extreme level to where your functioning is impacted. As a trained grief therapist, as somebody who has worked with complicated, complex grief for many, many years, parasocial grief is one that is just even more nuanced than anything else. Like, I personally had a mini breakdown when David Bowie died. He was a lot of things to me in my life, and his music was a lot of things to me in my life. And when he passed, I had to mourn for the future without David Bowie in it. I had to mourn for the concerts that I would never get to go to, right? I would have to mourn for the music that would never get made. I never met him. I saw him live in concert once, but that doesn't count. But I had a grief process, 100%. There's also folks that when they've passed and they've been the villain and we've lost the ability to get justice too, I think happens, right? Like, I get really agitated when I'm diving into a true crime scenario and the suspected person, who most likely did whatever it is, commits suicide or dies before they can ever get convicted. That missing sense of justice. Yeah, that gets you too, right? But I think the biggest and most important thing is that all human beings walk through different situations at their own pace, at their own time, with their own feelings. And we don't get to dictate to them how they process it. And it's not their job necessarily to help you process it, unless they are a trained, paid grief counselor, therapist, preacher, whatever. And you can't fill the hole from one parasocial relationship with another parasocial relationship, or expect somebody else that you have a parasocial relationship with to explain and support you through the loss of a parasocial relationship. It's kind of like parasocial relationship inception. It doesn't work like that. I hope that helps. Maybe it's clear as mud. I don't know.